This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 13. The Stadholderate of William II. The Great Assembly. Upon the death of Frederick Henry of Orange, March 1647, his only son succeeded to his titles and estates, and also, by virtue of the Act of Survivance, to the offices of Stadholder in 6 provinces and to the Captain-Generalship and Admiral-Generalship of the Union. William was but 21 years of age, and having been excluded during Frederick Henry's lifetime from taking any active part in affairs of state, he had turned his energies into the pursuit of pleasure, and had been leading a gay and dissolute life. His accession to power was, however, speedily to prove that he was possessed of great abilities, a masterful will, and a keen and eager ambition. He had strongly disapproved of the trend of the peace negotiations at Münster, and would have preferred, with the help of the French, to have attempted to drive the Spaniards out of the southern Netherlands. The preliminaries were, however, already settled in the spring of 1647, and the determination of the province of Holland, and especially of the town of Amsterdam, to conclude an advantageous peace with Spain and to throw over France, rendered the opposition of the young Stadholder unavailing. But William, though he had perforce to acquiesce in the Treaty of Münster, was nevertheless resolved at the earliest opportunity to undo it. Thus from the outset he found himself in a pronounced antagonism with the province of Holland, which could only issue in a struggle for supremacy similar to that with which his uncle Maurice was confronted in the years that followed the truce of 1609, and to a lesser degree his father after 1640. Commerce was the predominant interest of the burgher aristocracies who held undisputed sway in the towns of Holland, and they, under the powerful leadership of Amsterdam, were anxious that the peace they had secured should not be disturbed. They looked forward to lightening considerably the heavy load of taxation which burdened them, by reducing the number of troops and ships of war maintained by the States. To this policy the young prince was resolutely opposed, and he had on his side the prestige of his name and a vast body of popular support even in Holland itself, among that great majority of the inhabitants, both of town and country, who were excluded from all share in government and administration, and were generally Orangist in sympathy. He also had with him the officers of the army and navy and the preachers. His chief advisers were his cousin William Frederick, Stadholder of Friesland, and Cornelis van Aerssens, son of Francis, Lord of Sommelsdijk. By the agency of Sommelsdijk he put himself in secret communication with Count d'Estrades, former French ambassador at the Hague, now governor of Dunkirk, and through him with Mazarin, with the view of concluding an alliance with France for the conquest of the Spanish Netherlands, and for sending a joint expedition to England to overthrow the parliamentary forces and establish the Stuarts on the throne. Mazarin was at this time, however, far too much occupied by his struggle with the Fronde to listen to the overtures of a young man who had as yet given no proof of being in a position to give effect to his ambitious proposals. Nevertheless, the prince was in stern earnest. In April 1648 his brother-in-law, James, Duke of York, had taken refuge at the Hague, and was followed in July by the Prince of Wales. William received them with open arms, and urged on by his wife, the Princess Royal, and by her aunt, the exiled Queen of Bohemia, who with her family was still residing at the Hague, he became even more eager to assist in effecting a Stuart restoration than in renewing the war with Spain. The difficulties in his way were great. In 1648 public opinion in the States on the whole favoured the parliamentary cause. But when the Parliament sent over Dr. Doreslaer and Walter Strickland as envoys to complain of royal ships being allowed to use Dutch harbours, the States General, through the influence of the Prince, refused them an audience. The Estates of Holland on this gave a signal mark of their independence and antagonism by receiving Doreslaer and forbidding the royal squadron to remain in any of the waters of the province. The news of the trial of King Charles for high treason brought about a complete revulsion of feeling. The Prince of Wales himself in person begged the States General to intervene on his father's behalf, and the proposal met with universal approval. It was at once agreed that Adrian Pauw, the now aged leader of the anti-Orange party in Holland, should go to London to intercede for the King's life. He was courteously received on January 26th OS, and was granted an audience by the House of Commons, but the decision had already been taken and his efforts were unavailing. The execution of the King caused a wave of horror to sweep over the Netherlands, and an address of condolence was offered by the States General to the Prince of Wales. But to meet the wishes of the delegates of Holland he was addressed not as King of Great Britain, but simply as King Charles II, and it was agreed that Joachimi, the resident ambassador in London, should not be recalled at present. The new English government on their part sent over once more Dr. Doreslaer with friendly proposals for drawing the two republics into closer union. Doreslaer, who had taken part in the trial of Charles I, was especially obnoxious to the royalist exiles, who had sought refuge in Holland. He landed on May 9th. 3 days later he was assassinated as he was dining at his hotel. The murderers, 5 or 6 in number, managed to make their escape and were never apprehended. Although highly incensed by this outrage, the English government did not feel itself strong enough to take decided action. The Estates of Holland expressed through Joachimi their abhorrence at what had occurred, and the Parliament instructed Strickland to approach the States General again with friendly advances. The States General refused to grant him an audience, while receiving the envoy dispatched by Charles II from Scotland to announce his accession. The English Council of State had no alternative but to regard this as a deliberate insult. Strickland was recalled and left Holland July 22nd. On September 26th Joachimi was ordered to leave London. The breach between the two countries seemed to be complete, but the Estates of Holland, who for the sake of their commerce dreaded the thought of a naval war, did all in their power to work for an accommodation. They received Strickland in a public audience before his departure, and they ventured to send a special envoy to Whitehall, Gerhard Schepp, January 22nd, to treat with the Parliament. By this action the Provincial Estates flouted the authority of the States General, and entered into negotiations on their own account, as if they were an independent state. The Hollanders were anxious to avoid war almost at any price, but circumstances proved too strong for them. In order to carry out this pacifist policy, the Estates of Holland now resolved to effect a large reduction of expenditure by disbanding a portion of the troops and ships. When the Peace of Münster was signed, the States possessed an army of 60,000 men, and all parties were agreed that this large force might safely be reduced. In July 1648 a drastic reduction was carried out, 25,000 men being disbanded. The Estates of Holland, however, demanded a further retrenchment of military charges, but met with the strong opposition of the Prince and his cousin William Frederick, who declared that an army of at least 30,000 was absolutely necessary for garrisoning the frontier fortresses and safeguarding the country against hostile attack. Their views had the support of all other provinces, but Holland was obdurate. In Holland commerce reigned supreme, and the burgher regents and merchants were suspicious of the prince's warlike designs and were determined to thwart them. Finding that the States General refused to disband at their dictation some 55 companies of the excellent foreign troops who formed the kernel of the States Army, the Provincial Estates proceeded to take matters into their own hands, and discharged a body of 600 foreign troops which were paid by the province. In doing this they were acting illegally. The old question of the sovereign rights of the provinces, which had been settled in 1619 by the sword of Maurice, was once more raised. The States General claimed to exercise the sole authority in military matters. There were not 7 armies in the Union, but 1 army under the supreme command of the Captain General appointed by the States General. The Captain General was now but a young and inexperienced man, but he had none of the hesitation and indecision shown by his uncle Maurice in the troubles of 1618–19, and did not shrink from the conflict with the dominant province to which he was challenged. For some time indeed wrangling went on. There was a strong minority in the Estates of Holland opposed to extreme measures, and the council pensionary, Jacob Cats, was a moderate man friendly to the House of Orange. An accommodation was reached on the subject of the disbanding of the 600 foreign troops, but the conflict was renewed, and in the middle of 1650 it assumed grave proportions. The heart and soul of the opposition to the Prince was Amsterdam. William had for some time been urged by his Friesland cousin to take action, since the attitude of Amsterdam threatened the dissolution of the Union. The Prince was at this time engaged in negotiating with France, but nothing had as yet been settled, and his projects were not ripe for execution. Nevertheless, it was absolutely necessary for their realization that the military forces should not be excessively reduced. Under his influence the States General decided that, though the number of troops in the several regiments should be decreased, the cadres of all regiments, with their full quota of officers, should be retained. To this the Estates of Holland assented, and finding that they could not prevail, they determined on a daring step. Orders were sent June 1, 1650, to the colonels of the regiments on the provincial war sheet to disband their regiments on pain of stoppage of pay. The colonels refused to take any orders save from the Council of State and the Captain General. The Prince accordingly, with William Frederick and the Council of State, appeared in the States General and appealed to them to uphold the colonels in their refusal. There could be no question that the Estates of Holland were hopelessly in the wrong, for their representative in the States General had in 1623, 1626, 1630, and 1642 voted for the enforcement on recalcitrant provinces of the full quota at which they were assessed for the payment of the Army of the Union. The States General June 5 therefore determined to send a notable deputation to the towns of Holland. The Prince was asked to head the deputation, the members of which were to be chosen by him, and he was invested with practically dictatorial powers to take measures for the keeping of the peace and the maintenance of the Union. In doing this the Generality were themselves acting ultra vires. The States General was an assembly consisting of the representatives of the provincial estates. It could deal or treat, therefore, only with the estates of the several provinces, not with the individual towns within a province. In resisting the interference of the Estates of Holland with matters that concerned the Union as a whole, they were themselves infringing, by the commission given to the notable deputation, the jurisdiction of the provincial estates over their own members. The Prince set out on June 8 and visited all the privileged towns. The result was more than disappointing. The council of the premier municipality, Dordrecht, set the example by declaring that they were answerable only to the estates of the province. Schiedam, Alkmaar, Edam, and Monnikendam gave the same reply. Delft and Haarlem were willing to receive the Prince as Stadholder, but not the deputation. Amsterdam, under the influence of the brothers Andries and Cornelis Bicker, went even further, and after some parleying declined to admit either the deputation or the Prince. On July 25 William returned to the Hague bitterly chagrined by his reception and determined to crush resistance by force. The stroke he planned was to seize the representatives of 6 towns which had been specially obstinate in their opposition, and at the same time to occupy Amsterdam with an armed force. His preparations were quickly made. On July 30 an invitation was sent to Jacob de Witt, ex-burgomaster of Dordrecht, and 5 other prominent members of the Estates of Holland to visit the Prince. On their arrival they were arrested by the Stadholder's guard and carried off as prisoners to the castle of Loevestein. William had meanwhile left the execution of the coup de main against Amsterdam to his cousin William Frederick. The arrangements for gathering together secretly a large force from various garrisons were skilfully made, and it was intended at early dawn to seize unexpectedly one of the gates, and then to march in and get possession of the town without opposition. The plan, however, accidentally miscarried. Some of the troops in the night having lost their way, attracted the notice of a postal messenger on his way to Amsterdam, who reported their presence to the burgomaster, Cornelis Bicker. Bicker at once took action. The gates were closed, the council summoned, and vigorous measures of defence taken. William Frederick therefore contented himself with surrounding the city so as to prevent ingress or egress from the gates. On the next morning, July 31st, William, having learnt that the surprise attack had failed, set out for Amsterdam, determined to compel its surrender. The council, fearing the serious injury a siege would cause to its commerce, opened negotiations August 1st. The prince, however, insisted on unconditional submission. No other course was open. Amsterdam undertook to offer no further opposition to the proposals of the States General, and was compelled to agree to the humiliating demand of the Stadholder that the brothers Bicker should not only resign their posts in the municipal government, but should be declared ineligible for any official position in the future. The Prince of Orange had now secured the object at which he had aimed. His authority henceforth rested on a firm basis. His opponents had been overthrown and humiliated. The Estates of 6 provinces thanked him for the success of his efforts, and he on his part met the general wish for economy by agreeing to a reduction of the foreign troops in the pay of the States, on the distinct understanding that only the States General had the right to disband any portion of the forces, not the provincial paymasters. In the flush of triumph, William, at the end of August, left the Hague for his country seat at Dieren, nominally for hunting and for rest, in reality to carry on secret negotiations with France for the furtherance of his warlike designs. The complete defeat of Charles II at the Battle of Worcester, September 3rd, must have been a severe blow to his hopes for the restoration of the Stuarts, but it did not deter him from pursuing his end. With d'Estrades now governor of Dunkirk, the prince secretly corresponded, and through him matters were fully discussed with the French government. In a letter written from the Hague on October 2nd, William expressed a strong wish that d'Estrades should come in person to visit him, and it was the intention of d'Estrades to accept this invitation as soon as he had received from Paris the copy of a draft treaty which was being prepared. This draft treaty, which was probably drawn up by Mazarin, reached d'Estrades in the course of October, but circumstantial evidence proves that it was never seen by William. Its provisions were as follows. Both powers were to declare war on Spain and attack Flanders and Antwerp. The Dutch were to besiege Antwerp, which city, if taken, was to become the personal appanage of the Prince of Orange. When the Spanish power in the southern Netherlands had been overthrown, then France and the United Provinces were to send a joint expedition to England to place Charles II on the throne. Whether the prince would have approved these proposals we know not. In all probability he would have declined to commit himself to a plan of such far-reaching and daring character, for he was aware of the limitations of his power, and knew that even his great influence would have been insufficient to obtain the consent of the States General to an immediate renewal of war. Speculation, however, is useless, for an inexorable fate raised other issues. On October 8th the Stadholder returned to Dieren. On the 27th he fell ill with an attack of smallpox. He was at once taken back to the Hague, and for some days he progressed favourably, but the illness suddenly took a turn for the worse, and he expired on November 6th. The news of the prince's death fell like a shock upon the country. Men could scarcely believe their ears. William was only 24 years old, and though his wife gave birth to a son a week later, he left no heir capable of succeeding to the high offices that he had held. The event was the more tragic, following as it did so swiftly upon the coup d'état of the previous summer, and because of the youth and high promise of the deceased prince. William II was undoubtedly endowed with high and brilliant qualities of leadership, and he had proved his capacity for action with unusual decision and energy. Had his life not been cut short, the course of European politics might have been profoundly changed. As was to be expected, the burgher regents of Holland, when once the first shock was over, lost no time in taking advantage of the disappearance of the man who had so recently shown that he possessed the power of the sword and meant to be their master. The States General at once met and requested the Provincial Estates to take steps to deal with the situation. The Estates of Holland proposed that an extraordinary assembly should be summoned. This was agreed to by the States General, and the Great Assembly met on January 11, 1651. In the meantime the Holland Regents had been acting. The Estates of that province were resolved to abolish the Stadholderates and to press the States General to suspend the offices of Captain and Admiral General of the Union. Utrecht, Gelderland, Overijssel, and Zeeland were induced to follow their example. Groningen, however, elected William Frederick of Friesland to be Stadholder in the place of his cousin. The States party in Holland had for their leaders the aged Adrian Pauw, who had for so many years been the moving spirit of the opposition in powerful Amsterdam to Frederick Henry's authority, and Jacob de Witt, the imprisoned ex-burgomaster of Dordrecht. The Orange party was for the moment practically impotent. Stunned by the death of their youthful chief, they were hopelessly weakened and disorganized by the dissensions and rivalries which surrounded the cradle of the infant Prince of Orange. The Princess Royal quarrelled with her mother-in-law, Amelia von Salm, over the guardianship of the child. Mary asserted her right to be sole guardian. The Dowager Princess wished to have her son-in-law, the Elector of Brandenburg, associated with her as co-guardian. After much bickering, the question was at last referred to the Council of State, who appointed the Princess Royal, the Dowager Princess, and the Elector jointly to the office. This decision, however, was far from effecting a reconciliation between the mother and the grandmother. Mary did not spare the Princess Amelia the humiliation of knowing that she regarded her as inferior in rank and social standing to the eldest daughter of a King of England. There was rivalry also between the male relatives William Frederick, Stadholder of Friesland, and Joan Maurice, the Brazilian, both of them being ambitious of filling the post of Captain General, either in succession to the dead prince or as lieutenant in the name of his son. In these circumstances a large number of the more moderate Orangists were ready to assist the States party in preventing any breach of the peace and securing that the government of the Republic should be carried on, if not in the manner they would have wished, at least on stable and sound lines, so far as possible in accordance with precedent. The Great Assembly met on January 11, 1651, in the Count's Hall in the Binnenhof at The Hague. The sittings lasted until September, for there were many important matters to be settled on which the representatives of the 7 provinces were far from being in entire agreement. The chief controversies centred around the interpretation of the Utrecht Act of Union, the Dordrecht Principles, and military affairs. The last named proved the most thorny. The general result was decentralization, and the strengthening of the provincial estates at the expense of the States General. It was agreed that the established religion should be that formulated at Dordrecht, that the sects should be kept in order, and the placards against Roman Catholicism enforced. In accordance with the proposal of Holland, there was to be no captain or admiral general. Brederode, with the rank of field marshal, was placed at the head of the army. The provincial estates were entrusted with considerable powers over the troops in their pay. The effect of this and of the decision of 5 provinces to dispense with a stadholder and to transfer his power and prerogatives to the estates was virtually the establishment in permanent authority of a number of close municipal corporations. It meant the supersession alike of monarchy and popular government, both of which were to a certain extent represented by the authority vested in, and the influence exerted by, the Stadholder Princes of Orange, in favour of a narrow oligarchic rule. Moreover, in this confederation of 7 semi-sovereign provinces, Holland, which contributed to the strength, the finances, and the commerce of the Union more than all the other provinces added together, obtained now, in the absence of an eminent head, that position of predominance during the stadholderless period which now follows, for which its statesmen had so long striven, When the amiable Jacob Cats, the council pensionary of Holland, closed the Great Assembly in a flowery speech describing the great work that it had accomplished, a new chapter in the history of the Republic may be said to have begun. End of chapter 13.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Al Hunt, Alberta, Canada. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 14. The Rise of Jean de Witt. The First English War. Before the sittings of the Great Assembly had come to an end, a young statesman destined to play the leading part in the government of the Dutch Republic during 2 decades had already made his mark. After the death of William II, Jacob de Witt was not only reinstated in his former position at Dordrecht, but on December 21st, 1650, Jean, his younger son, at the age of 25 years, was appointed pensionary of that town. In this capacity he was ex officio spokesman of the deputation sent to represent Dordrecht in the Great Assembly. His knowledge, his readiness and pervasiveness of speech, his industry, and his gifts at once of swift insight and orderly thoroughness quickly secured for him a foremost place in both the deliberations of the Assembly and the conduct of the negotiations with the English Parliament, which at this time required very delicate handling. The many disputes which had arisen between England and the United Provinces during the period between the accession of James I and the Battle of the Downs in 1639 had never been settled. The minds of the Englishmen were occupied with other and more pressing matters while the Civil War lasted, but the old sores remained open. Moreover, the refusal of the States General to receive the parliamentary envoys, the murder of Doreslaer, and the protection afforded to the Royalist refugees had been additional causes of resentment, but the English Council had not felt strong enough to take action. The death of the Prince of Orange, following so quickly upon the complete overthrow of Charles II at Worcester, appeared at first to open out a prospect of friendly relations between the two neighbouring republics. In January 1651, the Great Assembly formally recognized the Commonwealth, and determined to send back to his old post in London the veteran ambassador Joachimi, who had been recalled. The English government on their part anticipated his return by dispatching, in March, Oliver St. John and Walter Strickland on special embassy to The Hague. They reached that city on March 27, 1651, and presented their credentials to the Great Assembly 2 days later. Their reception in the streets was anything but favourable. The feeling among the populace was predominantly Orangist and Stuart, and St. John and Strickland, greeted with loud cries of regicides and many abusive epithets, remembering the fate of Doreslaer, were in fear of their lives. On April 4, a conference was opened between the envoys and 6 commissioners appointed by the States to consider the proposal of the English government for a more strict and intimate alliance and union between the two states. The Dutch quickly perceived that what the English really wanted was nothing less than such a binding alliance, or rather coalition, as would practically merge the lesser state in the greater. But the very idea of such a loss of the independence that they had only just won was to the Netherlanders unthinkable. The negotiations came to a deadlock. Meanwhile, St. John and Strickland continued to have insults hurled at them by the Orangists and Royalist refugees, foremost among them Prince Edward, son of the Queen of Bohemia. The Parliament threatened to recall the envoys, but consented that they should remain, on the undertaking of the Estates of Holland to protect them from further attacks and to punish the offenders. New proposals were accordingly made for an offensive and defensive alliance without any suggestion of a union, coupled with the condition that both states should bind themselves not to allow the presence within their boundaries of avowed enemies of the other. In other words, the expulsion of the members and adherents of the House of Stuart, including the Princess Royal and the Queen of Bohemia with their children. In the face of strong popular affection for the infant Prince of Orange and his mother, even the Estates of Holland dare not consider such terms, and the States General would have angrily rejected them. After some further parleying, therefore, about fisheries and trade restrictions, it was felt that no agreement could be reached, and St. John and Strickland returned to England on July 31st, 1651. Their failure created a very bad impression upon the Parliament. all the old complaints against the Dutch were revived, and, as they had refused the offer of friendship that had been made to them, it was resolved that strong measures should be taken to obtain redress for past grievances and for the protection of English trade interests. At the instance of St. John, the famous Navigation Act was passed by the Parliament, October 9, 1651. This act struck a mortal blow at the Dutch carrying trade by forbidding the importation of foreign goods into English ports except in English bottoms, or in those of the countries which had produced the goods. Scarcely less injurious was the prohibition to aliens to fish in British waters, and the withdrawal of the rights based on the Magnus Intercursus, for the maintenance of which Dutch statesmen had so long and strenuously fought. There was consternation in Holland, and the States General determined to send a special embassy to London. At the same time, the Estates of Holland replaced Jacob Cats by appointing the aged Adrian Poe, a man in whose ripe judgment they had confidence, to the office of council pensionary. The chosen envoys were Jacob Cats and Gerard Scap from Holland, Paulus van de Pere from Zeeland, all three representatives of the two maritime and trading provinces. They arrived in England on December 27, 1651. Their instructions were to secure the withdrawal of the Navigation Act and to try and negotiate a new treaty of commerce on the basis of the Magnus Intercursus. They were also to protest strongly against the actions of the English privateers who, having been given letters of marque to prey upon French commerce, had been stopping and searching Dutch merchantmen on the grounds that they might be carrying French goods. The English government, however, met the Dutch complaints by raking up the long list of grievances that had stirred up a bitter feeling of popular hatred against the United Provinces in England, and by demanding reparation. They further demanded that the Dutch commanders should acknowledge England's sovereignty by striking flag and sail and by firing a salute whenever any of their squadrons met English ships in the narrow seas. It was these last two questions, the right of search and the striking of the flag, that were to be the real causes of the outbreak of a war that was desired by neither of the two governments. But popular feeling and the course of events was too strong for them. The news of the seizure of their vessels, not merely by privateers, but by an English squadron under Ayscue in the West Indies, had caused intense indignation and alarm in Holland, and especially in Amsterdam. Pressure was brought to bear on the States General and the Admiralties, who in pursuance of economy had reduced the fleet to 75 ships. It was resolved, therefore, on February 22nd, to fit out an additional 150 vessels. The Council of State, on hearing of this, began also to make ready for eventualities. Negotiations were still proceeding between the two countries when Martin Tromp, the victor of the Battle of the Downs, now Lieutenant Admiral of Holland, was sent to sea with 50 ships and instructions to protect Dutch merchantmen from interference, and to see that the States suffered no affront. Nothing was actually said about the striking of the flag. The situation was such that an armed collision was almost certain to happen with such as Admiral Tromp in command. It came suddenly through a misunderstanding. The Dutch admiral, while cruising past Dover, met on May 29th 15 English ships under Blake. The latter fired a warning shot across the bow of Tromp's ships, signifying that the flag should be struck. Tromp declared that he had given orders to strike the flag, but that Blake again fired before there was time to carry them out. Be this as it may, the two fleets were soon engaged in a regular fight, and the English being reinforced, Tromp withdrew at nightfall to the French coast, having lost 2 ships. Great was the anger aroused in England, where the Dutch were universally regarded as the aggressors. In the Netherlands, where the peace party was strong, many were disposed to blame Tromp despite his protests. Adrian Pauw himself left hastily for London, Jan de Witt being appointed to act as his deputy during his absence. Pauw's strenuous efforts, however, to maintain peace were all in vain, despite the strong leanings of Cromwell towards a peaceful solution. But popular feeling on both sides was now aroused. The States General, feeling that Orangists would stir up a revolt if humiliating terms were submitted to, stiffened their attitude. The result was that the envoys left London on June 30th, 1652, and war was declared. The Dutch statesmen who sought to avoid hostilities were right. All of the advantages were on the side of their enemies. The Dutch merchant fleets covered the seas, and the welfare of the land depended on commerce. The English had little to lose commercially. Their war fleet too, though inferior in numbers of ships, was superior in almost all other respects. The Stuarts had devoted great attention to the fleet, and would have done more but for lack of means. Charles' much-abused ship money was employed by him for the creation of the first English professional navy. It had been largely increased by the Parliament after 1648, and its generals, Blake, Penn, and Askew, had already acquired much valuable experience in their encounters with the Royalist squadron under Prince Rupert, and in long cruises to the West Indies for the purpose of forcing the English colonies to acknowledge parliamentary rule. The crews, therefore, were well trained, and the ships were larger, stronger, and better armed than those of the Dutch. The position of England, lying as it did athwart the routes by which the Dutch merchant fleets must sail, was a great advantage. Even more important was the advantage of having a central control, whereas in the Netherlands there were 5 distinct boards of admiralty, to some extent jealous of each other, and now lacking the supreme direction of an admiral-general. The war began by a series of English successes and of Dutch misfortunes. Early in July 1652, Blake at the head of 60 ships set sail for the north to intercept the Dutch Baltic commerce and to destroy their fishing fleet off the north of Scotland. He left Askew with a small squadron to guard the mouth of the Thames. Tromp, meanwhile, had put to sea at the head of nearly 100 ships. Askew succeeded in intercepting a fleet of Dutch merchantmen near Calais, all of them being captured or burnt, while Blake, with the main force off the north coast of Scotland, destroyed the Dutch fishing fleet and their convoy. After these first blows against the enemy's commerce, good fortune continued to attend the English. Tromp was prevented from following Blake by strong northerly winds. He then turned upon Askew, whose small force he must have overwhelmed but for a sudden change to a southerly gale. The Dutch admiral now sailed northwards and, July 25th, found the English fleet off the Shetlands. A violent storm arose, from the force of which Blake was protected, while the Dutch vessels were scattered far and wide. On the following day, out of 99 ships, Tromp could only collect 35, and he had no alternative but to return home to refit. Before Tromp's return, another Dutch fleet under Michael de Ruyter had put to sea to escort a number of outward-bound merchantmen through the Channel, and to meet and convoy back the homecoming ships. He had 23 warships and 3 flagships under his command. Askew had previously sailed up the Channel with 40 men of war and 5 fireships for a similar purpose. The 2 fleets met on August 16th, and despite his inferiority of force, de Ruyter forced Askew to withdraw into Plymouth, and was able to bring his convoy home to safety. The ill success of Tromp, though he was in no way to blame for it, caused considerable alarm and discontent in Holland. His enemies of the States party in that province took advantage of it to suspend the gallant old seaman from his command. He was an Orangist, and as the Orange partisans were everywhere clamorously active, the admiral was suspect. In his place, Cornelis Witt de Witt was appointed, a capable sailor, but disliked in the fleet as much as Tromp was beloved. De Witt effected a junction with de Ruyter, and with joint forces they attacked Blake on October 8, near the shoal known as the Kentish Knock. The English fleet was considerably more powerful than the Dutch, and the desertion of de Witt by some 20 ships decided the issue. The Dutch had to return home with some loss. The English were elated with their victory and thought they would be safe from further attack until the spring. Blake accordingly was ordered to send a squadron of 20 sail to the Mediterranean, where the Dutch admiral Jan van Galen held the command of the sea. But they were deceived in thinking that the struggle in the Channel was over for the winter. The deserters at the Kentish Knock were punished, but the unpopularity of de Witt left the authorities with no alternative but to offer the command-in-chief once more to Martin Tromp. Full of resentment though he was at the bad treatment he had received, Tromp was too good a patriot to refuse. At the end of November the old admiral, at the head of 100 warships, put to sea for the purpose of conveying some 450 merchantmen through the straits. Stormy weather compelled him to send the convoy with an escort into shelter, but he himself, with 60 ships, set out to seek the English fleet which lay in the Downs. After some manoeuvring, the 2 fleets met on December 10th off Dungeness. A stubborn fight took place, but this time it was some of the English ships that were defaulters. The result was the complete victory of the Dutch, and Blake's fleet, severely damaged, retreated under cover of the night into Dover roads. Tromp was now for a time master of the Channel, and commerce to and from the ports of Holland and Zeeland went unimpeded, while many English prizes were captured. This state of things was, however, not to last long. Towards the end of February 1653, Blake put to sea with nearly 80 ships, and on the 25th off Portland met Tromp at the head of a force nearly equal to his own in number. But the Dutch admiral was conveying more than 150 merchantmen, and he had moreover been at sea without replenishment of stores ever since the fight at Dungeness, while the English had come straight from port. The fight, which on the part of the Dutch consisted of strong rear-ground actions, had lasted for 2 whole days, when Tromp found that his powder had run out, and that on the 3rd day more than half his fleet were unable to continue the struggle. But, inspiring his subordinates, de Ruyter, Evertsen, and Fleurissoon, with his own indomitable courage, Tromp succeeded by expert seamanship in holding off the enemy and conducting his convoy with small loss into safety. 4 Dutch men of war were taken and 5 sunk. The English only lost 2 ships. Meanwhile, both nations had been getting sick of the war. The Dutch were suffering terribly from the serious interference with their commerce and carrying trade, and from the destruction of the important fisheries industry, while the English on their side were shut out from the Baltic, where the King of Denmark, as the ally of the United Provinces, had closed the Sound, and from the Mediterranean, where Admiral Van Galen, who had lost his life in the fight, destroyed a British squadron off Leghorn, March 23rd. In both countries there was a peace party. Cromwell had always wished for a closer union with the United Provinces, and was averse to war. In the Dutch Republic the States Party, especially in Holland, the chief sufferer by the war, was anxious for a cessation of hostilities, and it found its leader in the youthful Jean de Witt, who on the death of Adrian Pauw on February 21, 1653, had been appointed council pensionary. Cromwell took pains to let the Estates of Holland know his favourable feelings towards them by sending over, in February, a private emissary, Colonel Dolman, a soldier who had served in the Netherlands wars. On his part, Jean de Witt succeeded in persuading the Estates of Holland to send secretly, without the knowledge of the States General, letters to the English Council of State and the Parliament expressing their desire to open negotiations. Thus early did the new council pensionary initiate a form of diplomacy in which he was to prove himself an adept. This first effort was not a success. The Parliament published the letter with the title Humble Supplication of the States of Holland. The indignation of the Orange partisans was great, and they threatened internal disturbances throughout the country. Such, however, was the skill of De Witt that, on Parliament showing willingness to resume the negotiations that had been broken off in the previous summer, he induced the States General by a bare majority, 4 provinces to 3, to send a conciliatory letter, the date of which, April 30th, 1653, coincided with Cromwell's forcible dissolution of the Rump Parliament and the assumption by him, with the support of the army, of dictatorial powers. The English Council of State, however, was well informed of the serious economical pressures of the war upon Holland, and their insistence now on the full satisfaction of all the English demands made a continuation of hostilities inevitable. Tromp, after successfully bringing the 2 large convoys of merchantmen, encountered, June 12th, near the Gabbard, the English fleet under Monk and Deane. Each fleet numbered about 100 sail, but the Dutch ships were inferior in size, solidity, and weight of metal. For 2 days the fight was obstinately and fiercely contested, but on Blake coming up with a reinforcement of 13 ships, Tromp was obliged to retreat, having lost 20 ships. He complained bitterly, as did his vice-admirals de Ruyter and de Witt, to the Board of Admiralty of the inferiority of the vessels of his fleet, as compared with those of the adversary. The English now instituted a blockade of the Dutch coast, which had the effect of reducing to desperate straits a land whose welfare and prosperity depended wholly on commerce. Amsterdam was ruined. In these circumstances direct negotiation was perforce attempted. 4 envoys were sent representing the 3 maritime provinces. At first it seemed impossible that any common ground of agreement could be found. Cromwell was obsessed with the idea of a politico-religious union between the 2 republics, which would have meant the extinction of the Dutch independence. The Council of State met the Dutch envoys with the proposal una gens, una republica, which nothing but sheer conquest and dire necessity would ever induce the Dutch people to accept. Accordingly the war went on, though the envoys did not leave London, hoping still that some better terms might be offered. But in order to gain breathing space for the efforts of the negotiators, one thing was essential, the breaking of the blockade. The Admiralties made a supreme effort to refit and reinforce their fleet, but it lay in 2 portions, 85 sail under Tromp in the Maas, 31 under De Witt in the Texel. Monk, with about 100 ships, lay between them to prevent their junction. On August 4 Tromp sailed out, and after a rearguard action off Catwick, outmanoeuvred the English commander and joined De Witt. He now turned, and with superior numbers attacked Monk off Scheveningen. The old hero fell mortally wounded at the very beginning of what proved to be an unequal fight. After a desperate struggle the Dutch retired with very heavy loss. Monk's fleet also was so crippled that he returned home to refit. The action in which Tromp fell thus achieved the major objective for which it was fought, for it freed the Dutch coast from the blockade. It was, moreover, the last important battle of the war. The States, though much perplexed to find a successor to Martin Tromp, were so far from being discouraged that great energy was shown in reorganizing the fleet. Jacob van Wassenaer, Lord of Obdam, was appointed Lieutenant Admiral of Holland, with de Ruyter and Evertsen under him as vice-admirals. De Witt retained his old command of a detached squadron, with which he safely convoyed a large fleet of East Indiamen round the north of Scotland into harbour. After this there were only desultory operations on both sides and no naval engagement. Meanwhile, negotiations had been slowly dragging on. The accession of Cromwell to supreme power in December 1653, with the title of Lord Protector, seemed to make the prospects of negotiations brighter, for the new ruler of England had always professed himself an appointment of the war, which had shattered his fantastic dream of a union between the two republics. Many conferences took place, but the Protector's attitude and intentions were ambiguous and difficult to divine. The fear of an Orange restoration appears to have had a strange hold on his imagination, and to have warped at this time the broad outlook of the statesman. At last Cromwell formulated his proposals in 27 articles. The demands were those of the victor, and were severe. All the old disputes were to be settled in favour of England. An annual sum was to be paid for the right of fishing, compensation to be made for the massacre of Amboina, and the officials responsible for it punished. The number of warships in English waters was to be limited. The flag had to be struck when English ships were met, and the right of search to be permitted. These demands, unpalatable as they were, might at least have furnished a basis of settlement, but there was one demand besides these which was impossible. Article 12 stipulated that the Prince of Orange should not at any time hold any of the offices or dignities which had been held by his ancestors, or be appointed to any military command. De Witt, in whose hands were all the threads of the negotiations, was perfectly aware that it would be useless to present such proposals to the States General. Not only would they indignantly reject them, but he had not the slightest hope of getting any single province, even Holland, to allow a foreign power to interfere with their internal affairs, and to bid them to treat with harsh ingratitude the infant heir of a family to which the Dutch people owed so deep a debt. There was nothing for it but to prepare for a vigorous resumption of the war. Strong efforts were therefore made at De Witt's instigation to increase the fleet and secure the active co-operation of Denmark and France, both friendly to the States. But Cromwell really wanted peace, and showed himself ready to yield on certain minor points, but he continued to insist on the exclusion of the Prince of Orange. Not till the Dutch envoys had demanded their passports did the Protector give way so far as to say he would be content to have the exclusion guaranteed by a secret article. What followed forms one of the strangest chapters in the history of diplomacy. De Witt had at this time been keeping up, in complete secrecy, a private correspondence with the leading envoy, his confidant Van Beverningh. Through Van Beverningh he was able to reach the private ear of Cromwell, and to enter into clandestine negotiations with him. The council pensionary knew well the hopelessness of any attempt to get the assent of the States General to the proposed exclusion, even in a secret article. Van Beverningh was instructed to inform Cromwell of the state of public feeling on this point, with the result that the Protector gave the envoy to understand that he would be satisfied if the Estates of Holland alone would affirm a declaration that the Prince should never be appointed Stadholder or Captain General. Whether this concession was offered by Cromwell proprio motu, or whether it was in the first instance suggested to him by De Witt through Van Beverningh, is unknown. In any case, the council pensionary, being convinced of the necessity of peace, resolved to secure it by playing a very deep and dangerous game. Not only must the whole affair be kept absolutely from the cognizance of the States General, but also De Witt was fully aware that the assent of the Estates of Holland to the proposed exclusion article would only be obtained with the greatest difficulty. He was to prove himself a very past master in the art of diplomatic chicanery and intrigue. The council pensionary first set to work to have the treaty, from which the exclusion article had been cut out, ratified rapidly by the States General, before bringing the secret article to knowledge of the Estates of Holland. The Estates adjourned for a recess on April 21st, 1654. On the following day he presented the treaty to the States General, and such was his persuasive skill that he accomplished the unprecedented feat of getting this dilatory body to accept the conditions of peace almost without discussion. On April 21st, the treaty, ratified and signed, was sent back to London. Only one article aroused opposition, Article 32, the so-called temperament clause, but Cromwell had insisted upon it. By this article, the States General and the Province Estates separately undertook that every Stadholder, Captain General, or commander of military or naval forces should be required to take an oath to observe the treaty. Meanwhile, De Witt had received a letter from Van Beverningh and his colleague Newport, addressed to the Estates of Holland, not at the moment in session, stating that Cromwell refused, on his part, to ratify the treaty until he received the Act of Exclusion from the Estates, who were until now wholly ignorant that any such proposal would be made to them. The cleverness and skill now shown by the council pensionary were truly extraordinary. A summons was sent out to the Estates to meet on April 28th without any reason being assigned. The members on assembly were sworn to secrecy, and then the official letter from London was read to them. The news that Cromwell refused to sign the treaty until he had received the assent of the province of Holland to the Act of Exclusion came upon the Estates like a thunderbolt. The sudden demand caused something like consternation, and the members asked to be allowed to consider the matter with their principals before taking so momentous a decision. 3 days were granted, but as it was essential to prevent publicity, it was settled that only the burgomaster should be consulted, again under oath of secrecy. At the meeting on May 1st, another dispatch from Van Beverningh was read, in which the envoy stated that the demand of Cromwell, that the act should be placed in his hands within 2 days after the ratification of the treaty, was peremptory and threatening. Unless he received the act, he would consider the treaty as not binding upon him. Using all his powers of advocacy, De Witt succeeded after an angry debate in securing a majority for the act. 5 towns, however, obstinately refused their assent, and claimed that it could not be passed without it. But De Witt had made up his mind to risk illegality and overruled their protest. The act was declared to have been passed, and was, on May 5th, sent to Van Beverningh and Newport with instructions not to deliver it until circumstances compelled them to do so. The proclamation of peace followed amidst general rejoicing in both England and the Netherlands, but for some 5 weeks the existence of the act was unknown to the States General, and during that period, as a fact, it remained in Van Beverning's possession still undelivered. Early in June, a bribe induced one of De Witt's clerks to betray the secret to Count William Frederick. The news soon spread, and loud was the outcry of the Orange partisans and of the 2 princesses, who at once addressed a remonstrance to the States General. All the other provinces strongly protested against the action of the Estates of Holland and of the council pensionary. De Witt attempted to defend himself and the Estates by vague statements, avoiding the main issue, but insisting that nothing illegal had been done. His efforts were in vain. On June 6th, the States General passed a resolution that the envoys in England should be ordered to send back at once all the secret instructions they had received from Holland and the Act of Exclusion. Meanwhile, the Estates of Holland themselves, frightened at the clamour which had been aroused, began to show signs of defection. They went so far as to pass a vote of thanks to the envoys for not having delivered the act to Cromwell. De Witt's position appeared hopeless. He extricated himself and outwitted his opponents by the sheer audacity and cleverness of the steps he took. His efforts to prevent the resolution of the States General from taking immediate effect proving unavailing, he put forward the suggestion that on the account of its importance the dispatch should be sent to the envoys in cipher. This was agreed to, and on June 7th the document was duly forwarded to London by the council pensionary, but he enclosed a letter from himself to Van Beverningh and Newport, informing them that the Estates of Holland assented to the request made by the States General, and that they were to send back the secret correspondence and also the act, if it were still undelivered. The result answered to his expectations. While the clerk was laboriously deciphering the dispatch, the envoys read between the lines of De Witt's letter, and without a moment's delay went to Whitehall and placed the act in Cromwell's hands. The States General had thus no alternative between acceptance of the fait accompli and the risk of a renewal of the war. No further action was taken, and the Protector professed himself satisfied with a guarantee of such doubtful validity. It is impossible to withhold admiration from De Witt's marvellous diplomatic dexterity, and from the skill and courage with which he achieved his end in the face of obstacles and difficulties that seemed insurmountable. But for the course of double-dealing and chicanery by which he triumphed, the only defence that can be offered is that the council pensionary really believed that peace was an absolute necessity for his country, and that peace could only be maintained at the cost of the Act of Exclusion. Whether or not Cromwell would have renewed the war had the Act been withdrawn is impossible to say. There is, however, every reason to believe that De Witt was prompted to take the risks he did by purely patriotic motives, and not through spite against the House of Orange. Be this as it may, the part he now played was bitterly resented, not merely by the Orange partisans, but by popular opinion generally in the United Provinces, and it was never forgiven. End of chapter 14.
LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 15. The Administration of John de Witt, 1654 to 1665, and from the Peace of Westminster to the outbreak of the Second English War. The position of John de Witt in July 1654 was a difficult one. The conduct of the council pensionary in the matter of the Act of Exclusion was openly attacked in the States General. Had the leaders of the Orange party been united, the attack might have had serious consequences, but notoriously the Princess Royal, the Princess Dowager and William Frederick were on bad terms, and De Witt, with his usual adroitness, knew well how to play off one against another. To meet the accusations of his assailants in the States General, he drew up, however, an elaborate defence of the action taken by the Estates of Holland and by himself. The document bore the title Deduction of the Estates of Holland. It was laborious rather than convincing, and it did not convince opponents. Nevertheless, though resentment continued to smoulder, the fact that peace had been assured soon reconciled the majority to allow the doubtful means by which it had been obtained to be overlooked. The tact, the persuasiveness, the great administrative powers of the council pensionary effected the rest, and his influence from this time forward continued to grow, until he attained to such a control over every department of government as not even Oldenbarneveldt had possessed in the height of his power. John de Witt was possibly not the equal of the famous advocate in sheer capacity for great affairs, but he had practical abilities of the highest order as a financier and organiser, and he combined with these more solid qualifications a swiftness of courageous decision in moments of emergency, which his almost infinite resourcefulness in extricating himself from difficult and perilous situations enabled him to carry to a successful issue. His marriage in February 1655 to Vendale Bicker, who belonged to one of the most important among the ruling burgher families of Amsterdam, brought to him enduring domestic happiness. It was likewise of no slight political value. Andries and Cornelis Bicker, who had headed the opposition to William II, and had been declared by him in 1650 incapable of holding henceforth any municipal office, were her uncles, while her maternal uncle, Cornelis de Graaf, was a man of weight and influence both in his native town and in the provincial estates. By this close relationship with such leading members of the regent aristocracy of Amsterdam, the council pensionary became almost as secure of the support of the commercial capital in the north of Holland as he was already of Dordrecht in the south. Two of his cousins, Slingelandt and Vivian, were in turn his successors as pensionaries of Dordrecht, while for his predecessor in that post, Nicholas Rous, he obtained the extremely influential office of a griffier, or secretary to the States General. Nor did he scruple to exercise his powers of patronage for other members of his family. His father, Jacob de Witt, was made a member of the Chamber of Finance, his elder brother Cornelis, Ruwaard of Putten. By these and other appointments of men who were his friends and supporters to important positions, diplomatic, military and naval, De Witt contrived to strengthen more and more his personal authority and influence. And yet in thus favouring his relatives and friends let us not accuse De Witt of base motives or of venality. He firmly believed in his own ability to serve the state, and without doubt he was convinced that it was for the best interest of his country for him to create for himself, as far as was possible amidst the restrictions by which he was hemmed in on every side, a free field of diplomatic and administrative action. No one, not even his bitterest enemies, ever charged John de Witt with personal corruption. Throughout his whole career he lived quietly and unostentatiously as a simple citizen on a very moderate income, and he died a poor man. One of the first cares of the council pensionary after the peace with England was to deal with the internal troubles which were disturbing certain parts of the land, notably Groningen, Zeeland and Overyssel. In the last named province a serious party struggle arose out of the appointment of a strong Orangist named Haersolte to the post of Drost or governor of Twente. The Estates were split up, the Orange partisans meeting at Zwolle, the anti-Orange at Deventer. Both enlisted troops, but those of Zwolle were the stronger and laid siege to Deventer. The victorious Orangists then nominated William III as Stadholder, with William Frederick as his lieutenant. At last, after 3 years' strife, the parties called in De Witt and William Frederick as mediators, but De Witt was far too clever for the Friesland Stadholder. It happened that the post of field marshal had just fallen vacant by the death of Brederode. Both William Frederick and his cousin Johan Maurice aspired to the office. The council pensionary induced his co-mediator, with the hope of becoming Brederode's successor, to yield on all points. Haersolte was deprived of office, the prince's appointment as Stadholder was suspended until his majority, and therefore William Frederick could not act as his lieutenant. Thus peace was restored to Overyssel, but William Frederick was not appointed field marshal. In the other provinces the tact and skill of De Witt were equally successful in allaying discord. He would not have been so successful had the Orange party not been hopelessly divided and had it possessed capable leaders. As an administrator and organiser, the council pensionary at once applied himself to two most important tasks, financial reform and naval reconstruction. The burden of debt upon the province of Holland, which had borne so large a part of the charges of the war, was crushing. The rate of interest had been reduced in 1640 from 6 to 5%, but the cost of the English war, which was wholly a naval war, had caused the debt of Holland to mount to 153 million guilders, the interest on which was 7 million guilders per annum. De Witt first took in hand a thorough overhauling of the public accounts, by means of which he was enabled to check unnecessary outlay and to effect a number of economies. Finding, however, that despite his efforts to reduce expenditure he could not avoid an annual deficit, the council pensionary took the bold step of proposing a further reduction of interest from 5 to 4%. He had some difficulty in persuading the investors in government funds to consent, but he overcame opposition by undertaking to form a sinking fund by which the entire debt should be paid off in 41 years. Having thus placed the finances of the province on a sound basis, De Witt next brought a similar proposal before the States General, with the result that the interest on the Generality debt was likewise reduced to 4%. The English war had conclusively proved to the Dutch their inferiority in the size and armament of their war vessels, and of the need of a complete reorganisation of the fleet. De Witt lost no time in taking the necessary steps. The custom which had hitherto prevailed of converting merchantmen into ships of war at the outbreak of hostilities was abandoned. Steps were taken to build steadily, year by year, a number of large, strongly constructed, powerfully armed men of war, mounting 60, 70 and 80 guns. These vessels were specially adapted for passing in and out of the shallow waters, and were built for strength rather than for speed. Again, the part taken in the war by the light, swift-sailing English frigates led to a large flotilla of these vessels being built, so useful for scouting purposes and for preying upon the enemy's commerce. The supply and training of seamen was also dealt with, and the whole system of pay and of prize money revised and reorganised. It was a great and vitally necessary task, and subsequent events were to show how admirably it had been carried out. No one knew better than John de Witt that peace was the chief interest of the United Provinces, but his lot was cast in troubled times, and he was one of those prescient statesmen who perceive that meekness in diplomacy and willingness to submit to injury do not promote the cause of peace or further the true interests of any country. The conquests of France in the southern Netherlands caused great anxiety to the Dutch, and the high-handed action of French pirates in searching and seizing Dutch merchantmen in the Mediterranean aroused much indignation. The States, acting on De Witt's advice, replied by sending a squadron under De Ruyter to put a stop to these proceedings. The Dutch admiral took vigorous action and captured some French freebooters. The French government thereupon forbade Dutch vessels to enter French harbours. The Dutch replied by a similar embargo and threatened to blockade the French coast. This threat had the desired effect, and an accommodation was reached. The Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659, by which the French retained a large part of their conquests in Flanders, Hainault and Namur, while the English acquired possession of Dunkirk, was disquieting. For the relations with England, despite the goodwill of the Protector, were far from satisfactory. The trade interests of the two republics clashed at so many points that a resumption of hostilities was with difficulty prevented. More especially was this the case after the outbreak of war with Portugal in November, 1657. The Dutch accused the Portuguese government of active connivance with the successful revolt of the Brazilian colonists against Dutch rule. What was once Dutch Brazil was now claimed by the Lisbon government as a Portuguese possession, and De Witt demanded an indemnity. As this was not conceded, a squadron under Opdam in November, 1657, blockaded the Portuguese coast, while another under De Ruyter made many sieges of merchant vessels. Cromwell was disposed to intervene, but his death on September 3, 1658, removed any fears of English action. Meanwhile the Dutch captured Ceylon and Macassar and practically cut off Portuguese intercourse with the East Indies. At last, in August 1661, a treaty was signed by which the Dutch abandoned all territorial claims in Brazil, but were granted freedom of trade and an indemnity of 8 million guilders to be paid in 16 years, and, what was more valuable, they retained possession of their conquests in the East. The protracted dispute with Portugal was, however, of quite subordinate importance to the interest of the Dutch in the complications of the so-called Northern War. On the abdication of Christina in 1654, Charles X Gustavus had succeeded to the Swedish throne. The new king was fired with the ambition of following in the footsteps of Gustavus Adolphus, and of rendering Sweden supreme in the Baltic by the subjection of Poland and Denmark. Charles was a man of great force of character and warlike energy, and he lost no time in attempting to put his schemes of conquest into execution. Having secured the alliance of the Great Elector, anxious also to aggrandise himself in Polish Prussia, the Swedish king declared war against Poland, and in the early summer of 1656 laid siege to Danzig. But the importance of the Baltic trade to Holland was very great, and Danzig was the corn emporium of the Baltic. Under pressure, therefore, of the Amsterdam merchants, the States General despatched in July a fleet of 42 ships under Obdam van Wassenaer through the Sound, which raised the siege of Danzig and with Polish consent left a garrison in the town. Thus checked, the Swedish king at Elbing in September, 1656, renewed amicable relations with the Republic, and Danzig was declared a neutral port. At the same time a defensive alliance was concluded between the States and Denmark. It was obvious from this that the Dutch were hostile to Swedish pretensions and determined to resist them. De Witt was anxious to preserve peace, but he had against him all the influence of Amsterdam and that of the able diplomatist Van Beuningen, who after being special envoy of the States at Stockholm had now been sent to Copenhagen. Van Beuningen held that, whatever the risks of intervention on the part of the States, the control of the Sound must not fall into the hands of Sweden. The emergency came sooner than was expected. Brandenburg having changed sides, the Swedes were expelled from Poland, and Frederick III of Denmark, despite the advice of De Witt, seized the opportunity to declare war on Sweden. Although it was the depth of winter, Charles Gustavus lost no time in attacking Denmark. He quickly drove the Danes from Schonen and Funen and invaded Seeland. Frederick was compelled at Roskilde in February, 1658, to accept the terms of the conqueror. Denmark became virtually a Swedish dependency and undertook to close the Sound to all foreign ships. Involved as the Republic was in disputes at this time with both France and England, and engaged in war with Portugal, De Witt would have been content to maintain a watchful attitude in regard to Scandinavian matters, and to strive by diplomacy to secure from Sweden a recognition of Dutch rights. But his hand was forced by Van Beuningen, who went so far as to urge the Danish king to rely on his defensive alliance with the Republic and to break the Treaty of Roskilde. Charles Gustavus promptly invaded Denmark, drove the Danish fleet from the sea, placed strong garrisons at Elsinore and Kromborg, and laid siege to Copenhagen. Van Beuningen had proudly asserted that "the oaken keys of the Sound lay in the docks of Amsterdam," and his boast was no empty one. At the beginning of October a force of 35 vessels under Obdam, carrying 4000 troops, sailed for the Sound with orders to destroy the Swedish fleet and to raise the siege of Copenhagen. On November 8 Obdam encountered the Swedes in the entrance to the Baltic. The Swedish admiral Wrangel had 45 ships under his command, and the battle was obstinate and bloody. Obdam carried out his instructions. Only a remnant of the Swedish fleet found refuge in the harbour of Landskrona, but the Dutch also suffered severely. The two vice admirals, Witte de Witt and Floriszoon, were killed, and Obdam himself narrowly escaped capture, but Copenhagen was freed from naval blockade. Charles Gustavus, however, held military possession of a large part of Denmark, and in the spring began to press the attack on the capital from the land side. As both England and France showed a disposition to interfere in the conflict, the States General now acted with unexpected vigour, recognising that this question to them was vital. An imposing force of 75 warships carrying 12,000 troops and mounting 3000 guns was dispatched in May, 1659, under De Ruyter to the Baltic. Negotiations for peace between the Scandinavian powers under the mediation of France, England and the United Provinces were now set on foot and dragged on through the summer. But neither Charles Gustavus nor Frederick could be brought to agree to the terms proposed, and the former in the autumn again threatened Copenhagen. In these circumstances De Ruyter was ordered to expel the Swedes from Funen. On November 24 the town of Nyborg was taken by storm and the whole Swedish force compelled to surrender. De Ruyter was now supreme in the Baltic and closely blockaded the Swedish ports. The spirit of Charles Gustavus was broken by these disasters. He died on February 20, 1660. Peace was now concluded at Oliva on conditions favourable to Sweden, but securing for the Dutch the free passage of the Sound. The policy of De Witt was at once firm and conciliatory. Without arousing the active opposition of England and France, he, by strong-handed action at the decisive moment, succeeded in maintaining that balance of power in the Baltic which was essential in the interest of Dutch trade. The Republic under his skilful leadership undoubtedly gained during the northern wars fresh weight and consideration in the councils of Europe. The Peace of the Pyrenees, followed by the Peace of Oliva and the settlement with Portugal, seemed to open out to the United Provinces a period of rest and recuperation, but probably no one knew better than the council pensionary that outward appearances were deceptive. In the spring of 1660 a bloodless revolution had been accomplished in England, and Charles II was restored to the throne. The hostility of De Witt and of the States party to the House of Stuart had been marked. It happened that Charles was at Breda when he received the invitation recalling him to England. The position was a difficult one, but the council pensionary at once saw with his usual perspicacity that there was but one course to pursue. Acting under his advice, every possible step was taken by the States General and the Estates of Holland to propitiate the prince, who, from being a forlorn exile, had suddenly become a powerful king. Immense sums were spent upon giving him a magnificent reception at the Hague, and when he set sail from Scheveningen deputations from the States General and the Estates of Holland attended in state his embarkation, and lavish promises of friendship were exchanged. It was significant, however, that Charles handed to the council pensionary a declaration commending to the care of their High Mightinesses the Princess my sister and the Prince of Orange my nephew, persons who are extremely dear to me. He had previously expressed the same wish to De Witt privately, and compliance with it, i.e. the annulling of the Act of Exclusion, was inevitable. But all the actors in this comedy were playing a part. Charles was not deceived by all this subservience, and continuing to entertain a bitter grudge against De Witt and his party, only waited his time to repay their enmity in kind. De Witt, on his side, though in his anxiety to conciliate the new royalist government he consented to deliver up 3 regicides who were refugees in Holland, an act justly blamed, refused to restore the Prince of Orange to any of the ancient dignities and offices of his forefathers. Acting, however, on his advice, the Estates of Holland passed a unanimous resolution declaring William a ward of the estates and voting a sum of money for his maintenance and education. Very shortly after this momentous change in the government of England, Cardinal Mazarin died in March, 1661, and the youthful Louis XIV took the reins of power into his own hands. Outwardly all seemed well in the relations between France and the Republic, and in point of fact an offensive and defensive alliance for 25 years was concluded between them on April 27, 1662. Later in the same year Count d'Estrades, formerly ambassador in the time of Frederick Henry, resumed his old post. The relations between him and De Witt were personally of the friendliest character, but the conciliatory attitude of d'Estrades did not deceive the far-sighted council pensionary, who was seriously disquieted as to the political aims of France in the southern Netherlands. By the Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 the French had already acquired a large slice of territory in Flanders and Artois. They had since obtained Dunkirk by purchase from Charles II. Moreover, Louis XIV had married the eldest daughter of Philip IV, whose only son was a weakly boy. It is true that Maria Theresa on her marriage had renounced all claims to the Spanish succession, but a large dowry had been settled upon her, and by the treaty the renunciation was contingent upon its payment. The dowry had not been paid, nor was there any prospect of the Spanish treasury being able to find the money. Besides, it was no secret that Louis claimed the succession to Brabant for his wife and certain other portions of the Netherlands under what was called the Law of Devolution. By this law the female child of a first wife was the heir in preference to the male child of a later marriage. The Dutch dreaded the approach of French military power to their frontiers, and yet the decrepitude of Spain seemed to render it inevitable. There appeared to De Witt to be only two solutions of the difficulty: either what was styled the cantonment of the southern Netherlands, i.e. their being formed into a self-governing republic under Dutch protection guaranteed by a French alliance, or the division of the Belgic provinces between the two powers. The latter proposal, however, had two great disadvantages. In the first place it gave to France and the Republic the undesirable common frontier. In the second place Amsterdam was resolved that Antwerp should not be erected into a dangerous rival. The last objection proved insuperable, and although De Witt had many confidential discussions with D'Estrades, in which the French envoy was careful not to commit himself to any disclosure of the real intentions of his government, no settlement of any kind had been arrived at when the threatening state of relations with England threw all other questions into the background. The accession of Charles II placed upon the throne of England a man who had no goodwill to Holland and still less to the council pensionary, and who, like all the Stewart kings, had a keen interest in naval and maritime matters. The Navigation Act, far from being repealed, was vigorously enforced, as were the English claims to the sovereignty of the narrow seas. The grievances of the English East India Company against its Dutch rival, with regard to the seizure of certain ships, and especially as to the possession of a small island named Pulu Rum in the Moluccas, led to a growing feeling of bitterness and hostility. A special embassy, headed by De Witt's cousin, Beverweert, was sent to London in the autumn of 1660 to try to bring about a friendly understanding, but was fruitless. At the same time George Downing, a skilful intriguer and adventurer, who after serving Cromwell had succeeded in gaining the confidence of the royal government, had been sent as ambassador to the Hague, where he worked underhand to exacerbate the disputes and to prevent a settlement of the differences between the two peoples. The position and treatment of the Prince of Orange had likewise been a source of difficulty and even of danger to the supremacy of the States party. There arose a general movement among the provinces, headed by Gelderland and Zeeland, to nominate William captain and admiral general of the Union and Stadholder. The lack of leadership in the Orangist party and the hostility between the two princesses rendered, however, any concentrated action impossible. De Witt, with his usual adroitness, gained the ear of the Princess Royal, who accepted the proposal that the Estates of Holland should undertake the education of the prince, and even consented that De Witt himself and his wife's uncle, De Graaf, should superintend the prince's study. This arranged, Mary, for the first time since her marriage, paid a visit to her native land, being desirous to consult her brother on various subjects. Unfortunately she died of smallpox in January, 1661, having nominated Charles as her son's guardian. This nomination did not tend to smooth matters between the two countries. There was a powerful war party in England supported by the Duke of York. It was at his instigation that a strong-handed act took place which aroused intense indignation in Holland. A company called the Royal African Company had been formed in which the Duke had a large interest. A fleet fitted out by this company under the command of Admiral Holmes seized in February, 1664, a portion of the coast of Guinea on which the Dutch had settlements. Strong protests meeting with nothing but evasive replies, in all secrecy a squadron was got ready to sail under De Ruyter, nominally to the Mediterranean. Dilatory negotiations were in the meantime being conducted by Beverweert in London and by Downing at the Hague in regard to this and other grievances, but without any approach to a settlement. Downing, in fact, was surreptitiously doing his best not to reconcile but to aggravate differences. Matters were brought to a head by the news that an English fleet had crossed the Atlantic and had taken possession of the Dutch colony of New Netherland in September. and at Holmes had made himself master of Cabo Corso on the West African coast, and was threatening further conquests. This was too much. De Ruyter received orders to proceed to Guinea, where he speedily drove out the English intruders and reoccupied the lost settlements. During the winter both powers prepared for a struggle for maritime supremacy, which had become inevitable, and at last war was declared by England on March 4, 1665. Chapter 15 of the History of Holland by George Edmundson.